Dr. Knobbe, thank you so much for joining us today. Listening to your talk here just a little while ago, some very compelling information, and I'd love to share it with the audience. But before we dive into that, I'd really like to know more about you. And as a practicing ophthalmologist, how do you go from practicing ophthalmology to being a nutrition advocate researcher, trying to understand more about chronic obesity?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me on your show, Peter. It's really an honor and pleasure and amazing to be with you. I'm such a huge fan. So, well, I don't like talking about myself, but I have so I've been an ophthalmologist since 1991, I guess, and so obviously I'm a physician, I'm an MD, and my history really in practice and such was that for 21 years of practice, I didn't understand anything about ancestral health or ancestral nutrition or root cause. I was your traditional thinking kind of physician that all these diseases and disorders had, were basically rooted in, if anything, maybe genetics and aging, and I was also suffering with my own arthritis most of those years. And in 2011, I made a change towards paleo diet, and it changed my arthritis, like 80% improvement in about 8 or 10 days. And this just drastically changed my thinking about nutrition. And then I read Lauren Cordain's The Paleo Answer, and that started changing my life. And I began to investigate nutrition, but I still felt like there were so many things that I felt lost about. And I eventually came across the work of Weston A. Price in 2013, and his book Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. And that's when I began to understand this big picture about how processed foods are driving all of this chronic disease. And that year, Peter, I theorized in my head, theorized that processed foods might be driving age-related macular degeneration. As an ophthalmologist, this is one of the most common things you see, like cataracts and macular degeneration are bread and butter conditions that we deal with all the time. And age-related macular degeneration, or AMD, is the leading cause of irreversible vision loss and blindness in people over the age of 50 worldwide. And the belief system in ophthalmology is that this disease, AMD, is driven by aging and genetics. The typical culprits, right? And so that year, late 2013, I began to think that possibly macular degeneration, because it is degenerative, as the name implies, is another one of these degenerative diseases. In other words, kind of tying it back to Weston Price's work that nutrient-deficient foods were driving degenerative conditions like arthritis and cancers and birth defects and so on. And so I began to investigate that in 2013 for about a year and a half while I was still in practice. And I was so convinced by February of 2015 that I was on to the right answer ultimately, but I didn't have the evidence. And so, but I left, I was so convinced this was the right thing to do, I left practice to pursue that full time. And we looked at data on processed foods by tracking proxy markers of processed foods, which in our case was, we used sugar and vegetable oils as proxy markers of processed foods in 25 nations. And that data in every single nation was in support of the hypothesis that it is indeed processed foods driving macular degeneration. And so I published a paper, wrote a book, published that, started a nonprofit foundation in that regard, and then eventually, just to kind of bring you more up to date, so that was like 2015, 16, 17, and by 2018, 2019, as I continued to investigate, I found more and more that the seed oils and high omega-6 diets seemed to be the drivers of overweight, obesity, diabetes, and so much chronic disease. And I just felt like no one was covering this properly. And I'm a data guy. I self-professed data junkie, and so I really started working on data in regards to vegetable oil consumption and all these chronic diseases and obesity as well. And I started, and so I began presenting on that in 2019, and here we are, almost 5 years later, I think. And this is where my life has come to, is that much of what I do now is invested in bringing together the data and the pathophysiology of how and why seed oils are driving all of this disease. So that kind of brings you up to date.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting, and thank you for sharing your history, and thank you for having the courage to say, I needed to step away and I needed to study this, because a lot of doctors will just continue to practice even once they discover, root cause.
Yeah.
And it just takes tremendous courage to do that. So I appreciate that. So seed oils, there's a lot of different seed oils. Like, we've got a whole huge history. Where did you land up on seed oils? Like, what kind of led you, to that? Were there certain epiphany moments in your research that, said it's seed oil versus, say, something else like sugar or trans fat? Well, a byproduct of seed oil, but...
Yeah, I would say it was the data, especially the data that my colleague, when we were working on this, her name's Maria Stoyanowska, she was the one that initially, because I didn't have the skills to do that back then, but she gathered all this data from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and some from the USDA and the Department of Commerce, and all this that went clear back into the 19th century, looking at vegetable oils for the United States and pretty early, like 1940-ish for the UK. But that data, as it came in, and I started seeing the correlations between vegetable oils and sugar consumption, my belief was that we needed to have higher vegetable oil and sugar consumption to drive macular degeneration, is what my thinking was back in 2015. And then this one country came in, it was Kiribati, which is a Central Pacific island nation. And in that nation, which is about 115,000 people, there was one ophthalmologist that was collaborating with us, and he was taking care of the whole nation, 115,000 people for one ophthalmologist. Wow. That's staggering. We have one ophthalmologist for every 20,000 people in the US, and a whole bunch of optometrists on top of that. So he took care of the whole nation. He saw 2 people with macular degeneration in Kiribati in the year of 2015, I believe it was. 2.
Wow.
I would see 2 people with macular degeneration every half day of clinic, probably, at least, right? And but anyway, but the thing about Kiribati was that the data, and there could be arguments about whether it's accurate coming out of the FAO for these tiny little countries that don't track very well. But the data showed that their sugar consumption was really high, but their vegetable oil consumption was virtually zero. And they had virtually zero macular degeneration. And at first I didn't like the data because the sugar was so high. And then I thought, well, data's data, right? If the data is true, and again, I didn't know until I began investigating. And there is some issues with these small countries and some of their data. It's not an issue in these big countries that track it all because of taxation, I think, is the reason they're tracked so carefully. But anyway, the data is very, very reliable in almost all the big developed countries. Not so reliable in these developing countries, I should say. And so, but anyway, nevertheless, that made me start thinking, that maybe vegetable oils are just a lot more problematic than I thought. I mean, I knew from Weston Price's research that he also called vegetable fats one of the problematic foods. But vegetable oil consumption was so low in the 1930s, particularly outside of the developed world, right? And so I began to gradually start making this connection. So it just made me want to keep investigating, like see what really are the issues. And so today, now what I see and what I presented here is that I see these long periods of time. For example, I just presented 65 years worth of evidence in the United States where sugar consumption is virtually flat. It doesn't change 5% between 1922 and 1987, while obesity goes through the roof and diabetes goes through the roof, right? But what's the one thing going way up? So between 1922 and 1987, sugar increased 5% in the US, but vegetable oils increased 605%. Obesity went up, I think it was 6.3-fold, and diabetes went up. That's a very large number. I don't remember exactly what that is, but between 1890 and 2016, diabetes in the U.S. went up 4,643-fold. And I always say,
Wow.
if it had doubled, that would be statistically significant, right? But it went up 4,643-fold. And the main thing that's changed all that time is the vegetable oils have gone from, well, they were 0 in 1865. They were 1 gram a day in 1900, 19 grams a day in 1960, 80 grams per person per day in 2010. 80 grams is 720 calories worth. It's 32% of U.S. caloric intake. Well, you can argue that's FAO data. That's the actual food consumption that reaches the consumer. So you say, well, there's some losses there that are unaccounted for, but they're mostly plate losses. And so, yeah, it's going to be a little bit lower, but the average American is consuming at least a fourth, and some a third of their diet is vegetable oils. And remember, they were absolutely 0 in 1865. We had no seed oils. We had no vegetable oils. Trivial amount of olive oil was the only thing. Probably 97% of the population had never even tasted olive oil through the American Civil War.